Please identify yourself, name and occupation.
My name is Fenton Bailey. I am a producer and director.
Please tell me a little bit about the state of New York, and in particular art and fashion around the time of Warhol's death, that sort of vacuum that was left.
You know, Warhol, let's see. Warhol died, gosh, was it 25 years ago? Yeah, 25 years ago. Yesterday, I think. You know, Warhol had, with his factory and his superstars, he had created this whole kind of alternative celebrity culture. And he had become this sort of grande dame in New York and would go to the Palladium and the Lime. He'd go out all the time. But he, in a way, had created this idea of a court of superstars that weren't Hollywood movie stars, that weren't necessarily rock stars. They were these alternative people. And when Warhol died, there was this sense of a sort of that generation or that era had finally come to a close. But of course, as in his later years, in his granddaddy years, that he had witnessed, and I think perhaps enjoyed seeing this other scene come along, of club kids. And in fact, before the club kids, there were these celebutantes, Michael Musto, Anita Sarko, James St. James, Patrick McMullen, these kind of die-hard New York club people who had become famous in the wake of what Warhol did with the factory. And as Warhol passed away, there was this new generation of wannabes, little basically just out of high school, these kids out of high school, and they were just at that time beginning to be called club kids. And their leader, of course, was Michael Alig.
So, when did you first hear of the club kid movement?
Well, I first heard of the club kid movement, I guess, when I looked at New York Magazine and saw club kids on the cover. But I'd actually known Michael Alig for like 4 or 5 years prior to that. And even if the name Club Kids hadn't really caught on, it was apparent that Michael was creating a whole scene around him. Michael came from, and now I forget where it was. Michael came from South Bend, right? And came to New York, and he worked as a busboy at Danceteria. And I think at first Michael wanted to be part of the celebutante scene. He wanted to be part of these die-hard New York club people who'd been around for years. But they wanted nothing to do with Michael. And so Michael, rather than being put off, just decided to go and create his own scene.
So, to someone who has never heard of them, who would never have even heard of what the club kids are, how would you describe what the movement was? Who did they speak for? Why did they pop? What was that all about?
Well, you know, I mean, at first Michael was a very well-behaved, nicely dressed, jeans, flannel shirts, you know, not particularly fashionable, kind of like just sort of almost preppy. He was this sweet little kid. And then Michael went off on this sort of tangent and created this look that was, well, it wasn't fashionable. It was actually anti-fashion. Everything about it was a slap in the face or a finger to what at the time was considered to be cool, chic, and fashionable. So platforms were like of the 70s, and he came up with these insanely high shoes. Or, I mean, no one ever did anything with lunchboxes, kiddie lunchboxes, but Michael adopted a little kiddie lunchbox as his sort of makeup case. And from there, this aesthetic grew of this sort of anti-fashion, juvenile / retarded, sort of deliberately foolish, deliberately uncool. And that is what the idea of a club kid came to be. It wasn't someone wearing expensive designer labels. They didn't wear Sprouse. They weren't wearing Parachute. They didn't go to Fiorucci. They weren't doing any of that brand label stuff. They were just putting a stupid thing on their head and walking out with it. It was a very, like, they had no money, so they weren't going to buy designer clothes, and they weren't trying to look cool. So the whole club kid was a kind of parody or reverse of what people were wearing to the clubs.
And who did this movement speak to?
Who did it speak to? Well,
What type of person?
you know, when Michael first came on the scene, and no one would give him the time of day, and no one would let him into clubs, you know, Michael didn't really speak to anybody. He was very, very shy and introverted. But then as this kind of surreal, Dadaistic movement of his gathered steam, it just spoke to other like-minded people, I guess, who also couldn't get into clubs, or people who were coming to the city and they'd been picked on at school or bullied or treated as fags or whatever it was. Michael embraced, you know, fat people, ugly people, weird people. It wasn't about being cool or trying to be part of the in crowd. It was people who were excluded from being the in crowd who formed their own mass. So who did it appeal to? It appealed to other people excluded from the chic elite.
Right. And so when did you first hear yourself? When did you first meet Michael Alec? What was your first sort of starting encounter?
I can't remember the actual day. I guess it was in the early 80s, and me and Randy were DJing at Congo Bill's, which was the 5th or 6th floor of Danceteria, can't remember. And this kid was a busboy. Michael Alig came up to us and asked us to play Blondie's Heart of Glass. That was the very first time I met Michael, and I was like, "Who are you?" And he's like, "I'm Michael Alig." And I'm like, "What do you do here?" And he's like running around sweeping up cigarette butts. But you know, it was interesting about Michael, because even though he was just a busboy, it was funny to watch him walking around the club because he didn't seem to be doing his job. He just sort of would sweep the odd fag end up into his thing, but he was looking around, kind of taking everything in, and I guess figuring out what his next move would be.
From that era, what would you say that you remember fondly? Tell me the good elements within the decadence. What was so great about that period of time in New York City?
Well, you know, I don't think I think New York nightlife is a sort of interesting thing, in that certainly in the 80s it was this alternative scene of painters and poets and performance artists, all these people who basically couldn't get arrested in the legitimate mainstream. And they were doing their own thing. And there was this sort of underground, thriving culture of gallery openings and events and fashion shows. And it was this sort of ferment of creativity. It really was very exciting. The club kids, though, were a very different iteration of that, because they weren't necessarily clothing designers, and they weren't necessarily, you know, wanting to put on, they didn't really necessarily want to do anything, but they did want to be famous. And a lot of people were critical of that and said that it was very nihilistic and very pointless, and what was the point of people wanting to be famous for the sake of being famous? But I think that what's interesting about it is that they were a very astute parody and satire of the kind of crass celebrity culture that we now live surrounded by. And so what I kind of fondly remember was how prescient they were. I didn't think at the time that they were particularly prescient, but I did enjoy the kind of crazy, kooky creativity of what they were doing. And in retrospect, from the point of 2012, they were very prescient. And in terms of fashion, you know, Lady Gaga has taken their visual wardrobe lock, stock, and barrel. And also, though, in terms of the idea of this sort of parody of celebrity and its sort of crassness. They really were on top of that at the very beginning. They recognized that it wasn't necessarily about writing a poem or having a band or painting a picture. It was really about getting noticed and being able to shift the attention in your direction. It was about spectacle and grabbing headlines and getting coverage. And let's face it, I mean, that is exactly the way celebrity culture operates today.
Proper. Andy, hands. You get hands as well. Okay.
Yeah, I've kind of.
Right, it's very expressive, man. As an alternative, do you think the Club Kid movement did it affect the gay community in a positive or in a negative way after it's all said and done?
I think that's a really good question about the overall positive or negative impact Club Kids had on the gay community. You know what? I think that I don't know if their impact was positive or negative on anyone or anything. I think they foretold, in much the same way that Warhol foretold the dynamics of our celebrity culture today, so they took it to the next level and anticipated its latest iteration. So is that good or is that bad? I mean, it's good. It's very clever. It's very foresightful. Has it been good for gay people? I don't know. I mean, I think in some respects it has been good in that there's a message of self-expression in there that is about fearlessness, about not caring what other people think, about not editing yourself to please others, not being buttoned down, not trying to fit in, blend in. And I do think that the message, that the idea of standing out rather than blending in is core to being gay. I don't think the gay community necessarily always believes in that message. The gay community often wants to be about blending in, not standing out. But I happen to believe personally that if you are gay, it's about expressing yourself and in your individuality and being true to that and leading an authentic life. That is the sort of birthright and the blessing of being gay. And even if it comes with a certain amount of pain, the hope is that you can just be yourself. I think that's a pretty good message, actually. I thought that was a rather rambling answer.
No, I mean, it makes sense. But if you want to add something to it.
Well, look, here, I think the Club Kids were a good thing for the gay community because I think they reminded us that integral to being gay is standing out, not blending in. You are your own individual. As a gay person, you are part of a minority of one. And you have to own that birthright and be true to that birthright. And that message is as true, by the way, for gay people as it is for straight people. All of us are unique individuals. And the work of being alive is to find out who you are and live an authentic life. And I think, that was a Club Kid message.
Is there just a sort of, we'll go back to that later. Is there any one particular night or event, just to get down to a little more of a nitty point, that stands out in your mind from that time that either may be outrageous or specific, or a night where you think everything changed, or is there anything that you can recollect?
Yeah,
Andy, you can go a little bit further. Give me that angle.
I'm not sure that Michael would appreciate me telling you this story, and Michael may not think it's a flattering story, and actually it isn't really a flattering story at all, but there was an AIDS benefit at Limelight, I think, and everybody had to give $5 to get in. And Michael goes up to the front and demands to be let in for free. And people were outraged and disgusted. You know, how could Michael Ehrlich refuse to give $5 to get into an AIDS benefit? You know what was interesting about that, I felt, was that all the press and the coverage that Michael got from refusing to pay a $5 fee, he could afford a $5 fee, but by choosing not to pay the $5, he got a lot more attention than if he'd just paid the $5 and gone in. So, yes, of course Michael should have paid the $5, but then on the other hand, what was so kind of quintessentially Michael was this ability to misbehave and reap the rewards from his misbehavior. And consequently also, he found, as a result, where it was he would be in demand. People enjoyed him being so badly and appallingly behaved. Oh, they scolded him. They were so disgusted by his behavior. Did you hear what Michael did? But there was a codependency in that people lived to talk about what awful thing Michael Ehrlich had done. And this kid who couldn't find a way to get in found his way in. That was one night. And then the other night, of course, that I remember very powerfully was at the very other end, at the very tail end, kind of the last gasp, really, of the whole club kid phenomenon. Or I guess it was really dead by then anyway. But anyway, it was in September 1996, and we went to James St. James's apartment to interview James and Michael. And they were doing Special K, cooking it up in the oven, and the apartment was kind of smelly, and they were sort of just messy and just not in a good way. And we sat and did the interview with Michael. And Michael said, yeah, I killed Angel, and then he sort of drifts off. And there was this moment there, he was joking, and his whole joke at that time was that he had killed Angel. He went around telling people he had killed Angel. He had guilty written on his forehead. You know, this was his shtick. It was all part of that Michael Ehrlich behaving badly shtick. You know, yeah, I killed someone shtick. But there was something in that moment, in that interview, that made me think, even though he had not yet been arrested, there was this feeling that, yes, he's joking, but also the truth may be that he did kill Angel. And you could feel that there was this sense, there was this sort of atmosphere in the air that whatever the club scene had started out as, whatever its intentions, its manifesto, and whatever creativity it had, and healthy irreverence, you felt that all that was long, long gone, and these were just a bunch of drug-addled people who were not in a good place.
Do you think that it was inevitable, that the collapse of that movement was inevitable, or is it the drugs that did it? Could it have lasted longer, or was it doomed from the very beginning?
Well, you can look at it lots of different ways. You could say that it was doomed from the beginning because at its core was a principle of antisocial, irreverent behavior that was obliged every time out to take it to the next level. And so at what point was too much? Was it going to be too much? You know, you go from having blood feast parties, which are kind of Halloween type events, to your invited parties where Michael is peeing in people's drinks and Michael has hepatitis. I mean, is that beyond the pale? Or, you know, at what point? But he was on this escalator in that he had to keep on being more and more outrageous. And so you could say, sooner or later, he was going to go too far. I don't think anybody thought sooner or later he was going to murder anyone. I think sooner or later people thought he would kill himself and just be another drug overdose casualty.
So what was your reaction to when you realized that he really did kill someone? What was your reaction to the murder? It was confirmed. And how was it, by the way? Well, he told you. This is before the Michael Musto piece came out, broke up. Andy, you can switch places.
Randy and I wanted to make a documentary about the club kids for years. And we tried, and we could never raise the money to make the film. But when the rumors about Angel's murder started circulating, then we were able to raise the money for the film, go figure. And we didn't actually believe at first that Michael had done it. It just seemed so impossible. I mean, Michael could do lots of bad things and behave badly, but to cross that line of taking someone else's life seemed completely off the charts. We just felt Michael was, he was a brat, he was badly behaved, but it was a bit of a leap from that to murderer. So we didn't really believe. We felt the rumors were good in terms of making the film, but we didn't believe it was true. We didn't believe Angel was dead or had met his demise at someone else's hand, and we certainly didn't believe Michael had killed him. And Michael was running around town, saying he'd killed Angel. So we knew he couldn't possibly have killed Angel because anyone who's going to murder someone isn't going to go around admitting to it. And if they do, surely the first thing that will happen is they'll be arrested. But Michael wasn't arrested. So as we set about making the film, we were convinced he had not done it. And the first time he really told me that, yes, he really had done it was after his arrest when I visited him in Rikers. And
what was that visit like?
Well, the funny thing about visiting Rikers is that it's not really much fun. Why should it be, It's just that if you are visiting a prisoner, you're almost treated like a prisoner yourself. You realize what a brutal environment it is. And so frankly, from getting on the bus and crossing the bridge and going into the prison, it was a very profoundly, for me, disturbing experience. I've never been to a prison before and didn't ever really want to go visit one again. At the same time, when Michael told me that he had killed Angel, that's something that you think about as, what does this mean if I have been a friend of someone who has murdered someone else? It's,
What was his disposition? How did you find him when you went to visit him? What was that visit like?
The visit was not great. They brought him out, and most of the time he was almost sobbing inconsolably throughout. I mean, it was very hard to make out a lot of what he said. He was crying so hard, and I was just trying to console him, to try and help him have the fortitude to get through what was going to be a long, hard experience. I mean, I realized that he had murdered Angel, and that was done, and now he was going to have to pay the time, do the time for that.
Is that camera still running? Because it shuts off sometimes. Are the numbers still going? Mm-hmm. Great.
I mean, when I saw Michael in Rikers, I didn't think he was going to survive. I mean, he was this sniveling mess, and I'm not saying I'd been any different, but I was just wondering how this person, really so uniquely unprepared for life in prison, was going to handle that or even survive it.
Are you surprised that he's made it all these years?
Well, I guess in some ways I'm not surprised that Michael has survived in prison because, I'm surprised he survived all the drugs he did, Most people, it seems, would have been finished off by several of the overdoses he experienced. So I guess, Michael's a tough cookie.
Now, not necessarily speaking of Party Monster, we'll get that to in a second. What type of films are you drawn to make, and why? What motivates you as a filmmaker? Just to step out of Michael Alex persona for a minute. What is WOW all about?
I think, World of Wonder, our vision, Randy and I's vision, is to tell the stories of people who have been judged or dismissed. To tell the stories of people who perhaps mainstream media doesn't feel those stories are worth telling. You know, if you look at, say, RuPaul's Drag Race, we managed RuPaul from the beginning of his career in New York, and we were always very passionate about what we believed to be his God-given talent and, you know, star power. Yeah, he was a drag queen, but we didn't understand why should a drag queen be excluded from the pantheon of stars. In our estimation, RuPaul was every bit as talented, actually perhaps more talented, than Madonna. And we just were thrilled and excited by every time he went on stage. And we've always had that feeling that, you know, whether it's drag queens or club kids or Tammy Faye Baker, there are all these people around us who have lived incredible lives and who have incredible stories to tell, but they, for some reason, society's judgment or prejudices, their story doesn't get told and they get pushed to the side. And yet, you know, to us, they're very vital, significant people. You know, someone like Monica Lewinsky, who had an affair with President Clinton, yes. Perhaps not the best idea, yes. But at the same time, you know, you talk to people and they all say, oh, I would have done that. I would have done that if I was in her shoes, men and women. And you feel that her story, her truth, has just never really had a chance to be heard. It's always been this, oh, Monica, this sort of woman with the scarlet letter, and she's been sort of shoved into a corner of people's prejudices in a way that seems just wrong.
So what compelled you to make a film about Michael Allen?
Well, you know, it wasn't really necessarily a film about Michael Alec. We wanted to make a film about the club kids. And we thought that there was a phenomena there that was really interesting.
Monster, we're talking about shockumentary, Party Monster.
Oh, I was talking about the shockumentary, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, moving on to Party
Sure.
Monster. What compelled you to make it?
Well, you know, after we made the documentary Party Monster about Michael Alig and the rise and fall of the club kids, it's a funny thing with documentaries. You can only really, you kind of depend on what you're told. You know, you do interviews, you go out and talk to people, and you're ultimately bound, though, by what they tell you. And we felt at this point, having made this documentary, that we'd gotten to know James and Michael so well, we were really interested in that relationship. They seemed like this kind of codependent couple. And we felt there was a greater truth to talk about in that relationship that perhaps we could explore through a scripted film. And we always imagined, we just wrote the script for Macaulay Culkin. There was just no one else in our mind who could play Michael Alig.
Why?
Because, you know, Macaulay Culkin is the Home Alone kid, or was the Home Alone kid. He was the most famous kid on the planet. He was the public's image of innocent childhood. And that was actually what Michael Alig was. But then he went on this club kid thing and became everybody's demon seed, the bad child. And we wanted Macaulay Culkin because we wanted to tap into that baggage to show that even in this twisted incarnation, Michael Alig was relatable to everybody.
Andy, you can switch for something else. What memories do you have of the shoot? What was the biggest obstacle to conquer?
Biggest memory of the shoot of Party Monster the movie?
Yeah.
Oh, God, it was like... The memories I have really are just to do with the fact that we had a fairly small budget and we had like 25 days to shoot everything in, and it was just one long sleepless blur, really. Yeah.
Now
I remember when it was over, I could hardly walk. Like my back had gone in some kind of seizure. And I do remember the last thing we shot was at the Chateau Marmont pool, recreating the interview that we'd done for the documentary with James St. James. And it was just one of those full circle moments to be sitting there with Seth Green wearing the exact same outfit that James St. James had worn, in the exact same position that I had interviewed James St. James all those years ago, and it was just one of those funny moments. But in a way, it couldn't be over too soon because it was just a nightmare to film. Everyone was very good. I mean, there weren't any real sort of crises. I think one of Macaulay's and Seth Green's favourite moments from making the film was when we split off as a unit. Randy stayed in Queens filming with Wilmer and co. And I took Macaulay and Seth Green and we hopped in a production vehicle and we went to Times Square and like it was 3 a.m. and we hopped out and we grabbed them walking towards us in the middle of Times Square. And that was, I think in the movie they were on their way to or on their way from the fast food party. And we just went and stole that shot, and they were very excited just to be able to go and grab that shot in the middle of Times Square in the middle of the night.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, now that the film has some somewhat of cult status, but how was the picture received? If you could repeat the question.
Yeah, when we made Party Monster, the shockumentary, it played at Sundance, and it was our first film at Sundance. But it wasn't in competition, and before they played it, they played a kind of, some kind of drunk driving PSA, and we were like, what? This is so weird. And I think it was because people perceived the film as having no moral compass or no real moral grounding. I think that's false, but that was people were a little bit freaked out by the documentary. Well, when we made the movie Party Monster, it was the same thing over again. People were almost felt that we had no moral, that we'd made an amoral film. And yet I think it's an extremely moral film. It just isn't moral in the good and bad sense that people are used to being fed in their movies and in their dramas. You have apparently very amoral characters at the center of it, apparently very hedonistic and self-indulgent, but at the same time, you also have a story that is actually quite traditional, that is like, drugs will fuck you up, and drugs will lead you down a path that is indefensible, and even the closest friends will be driven apart by drugs and by things like murder. And I think it's a very moral film. But people were quite kind of negative, I felt, when the film came out, and sort of appalled by its lack of perceived moral center. Subsequently, over the years, I think a younger generation who look at things slightly differently, not through that very good, bad moral filter, have felt differently about the film. And I think the film has found a more appreciative audience as a result. But at the time, it was a pretty brutal experience, I have to say. And when we made the documentary, I think we felt, we didn't quite get it right, because if we got it right, people would have embraced it more and the film would have been more successful. So then we make the feature film and we thought, this time we'll get it. And it was the same sort of thing of like, I don't know. I don't think it was, it certainly wasn't the kind of crowd pleaser, say, that The Eyes of Tammy Faye proved to be, where at the end everybody feels good, everybody's crying and clapping and happy. And it's much nicer to make a film like that because people are nicer to you. They pat you on the back, they congratulate you. Whereas with Party Monster, the sort of The praise was few and far between.
Well, I'm giving it a shot.
Well,
Now, Alec has never seen the film. What do you think will be his reaction when he finally sees it?
I wonder what Michael's reaction will be. I wonder what Michael's reaction will be when he sees the film. I sometimes wonder if he'll ever see it. I wonder if he'll come out of prison and just choose not to see it. Nah.
Michael Alec.
You don't want to see it, right?
React to the thing.
I expect he'll see it and he'll call me up and he'll be mad about some things. And, yeah. It's interesting. I haven't seen the film myself in years and years and years and years and years. So, I have no idea. I don't know what's in the film anymore, Yeah. I mean, he may like Macaulay Culkin's portrayal of him, he may not. It was interesting that the audience seemed to divide. Some people loved the way Macaulay played Michael and some people hated it.
Some people say he sounded a little like James.
Yeah.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
From some other people, but I thought it was good.
I thought so too. I thought so too.
Yeah. And now what?
What he got? What he got about Michael that was so perfect is that Michael is not a smooth presentation. He is not necessarily particularly articulate. His cadence of speech is always very halting and interrupted and choppy. So it's not like Michael is this amazing salesman who is smooth. And I felt Macaulay got the awkwardness of Michael perfectly. It was different to Michael's awkwardness, but it was an awkwardness. And I think that's really interesting because Michael, as a leader of people, it was just surprise. You would think he would be satanic, slick, smooth operator. That wasn't Michael at all. You would speak to him and you'd think, what a weird guy. You wouldn't necessarily think he is a leader. And I felt that was very important that Macaulay captured, in a way, that lack of charisma that Michael had.
Right. What legacy do you think the Club Kid era has left behind? If you want to maybe mention Gaga, you mentioned her before.
I think the Club Kid legacy is enormous, and you can see it in fashion. You can see it most obviously in Lady Gaga, who I think should probably just write Michael a big fat check when he comes out of prison. But, Michael was right that the sort of the freaky, absurd, antisocial, anti-fashion, all the leitmotifs of the Club Kids have gone on to enjoy mainstream commercial success at the hands of Lady Gaga and others, because it's a fact of the matter is that pop culture is such a hungry machine that inevitably things on the outer edges drift toward the center because the stuff in the center becomes out of date. It becomes has-been. It becomes obsolete. It becomes uncool. And so the pop machine needs more stuff, new stuff, and it pulls in from the outside. I remember, Liz Hurley wearing that safety pin Versace dress. I love saying Versace. It's my tribute to showgirls. Liz Hurley wearing that dress. People were outraged. It's so S&M. But now S&M, it's just, what, so what? It used to be Robert Mapplethorpe. It used to be dangerous, subversive. Now it's a Versace dress worn by Liz Hurley. Another thing is like the whole idea, the way that high fashion for women now is they all look like prostitutes and porn stars. Those kinds of fashions that were considered on the edges and antisocial and regressive and trashy, that's what the Kardashians dress like now. That is mainstream center fashion. So I'm not sure that it's all Michael's doing, but inevitably what the Club Kids were doing has become so mainstream as actually we probably don't even think about it now.
Very interesting. And so what would you say is the main difference between going out in New York back then versus now?
You know, I haven't been out in New York in about 25 years. I have no idea. And I tell you something else, like, you know, it was a weird, like, this probably you don't want to use this, but the truth is that we weren't ever really that into clubs. Me and Randy, we would DJ at clubs to earn some extra money, but we had jobs during the day. We had to go out and go to work. I went to work on Wall Street and Randy went to work on Madison Avenue. And then at night, we'd go and DJ in clubs. And let me tell you, it was exhausting and profoundly, in some ways, not fun. But we did get our start, really, doing what we do today in the New York club scene, because one of the things we did at Limelight was we did a thing called the Flaunt It Club. And the Flaunt It Club was a TV show. And Randy and I hosted it, and everybody who came in the audience could be on the show, and it was at Limelight. And at the same time as we were doing this, Michael Ailig was starting Disco 2000 at Limelight. And our event was a disaster and no one came. And Disco 2000 took off and was lines around the block. And I just remember being so frustrated, as if it wasn't bad enough that I had to go to work during the day and do this thing at night. Here was this little kid, basically, you know, just having a huge success, making a living, earning enough money to buy himself a condo. And here we were struggling, you know, and it was just, that was the beginning.
Do you say without that movement, you would have probably stayed on Wall Street? You would have been a different person without that sort of...
No, because really, I mean, no, Randy and I were really, we were drawn to the downtown scene, and we performed and had a band, and we were doing our own thing. We weren't really club kids, but we were old enough that when the club kids came along, we were old enough to appreciate something very different was happening, and we were just interested in it.
So you would have quit Wall Street regardless?
Oh yeah, I think so.
I did 5 years of Standard & Poor's myself.
Well, there you go, you see. I mean, and I think it would be a shame if you were to say that Michael Ailig changed your life. Maybe he did he?
Maybe a little bit, but I think it would have been on its course regardless. But yeah, to a certain extent, that era, you know, kind of, because I was doing the same thing.
But I tell you, Michael Ailig probably should have gone and worked on Wall Street, because he'd have made an excellent, he'd have been able to sell these mortgage-backed, you know, bonds to everybody. He'd have, like, conned everybody up the wazoo. He'd have probably done very, very well on Wall Street.
2 more questions. Now, Michael mentioned that once his parole officers saw Party Monster, that it influenced his sentencing, perhaps costing him a little more time. Can you comment on that?
You know, I don't think, Randy and I are filmmakers and storytellers, and we were compelled to tell that story. We found it to be a profound story, a tragic story, but also a story of great imagination and creativity and humor. And what makes it such a difficult story is it combines all those elements. And I believe that we never really demonized Michael in the telling of the story. I felt that we always told the story with accuracy and respect. And that's really, that's our responsibility, to tell the story as well as we can possibly tell it. We certainly would never tell the story with the intention of sending someone to jail or getting someone out of jail. You know, Michael's sentence is really none of our business. Michael's sentence is the responsibility of the courts and the justice system. I am sorry if a parole officer saw the film and felt Michael should not be released because of it. I don't think that message is in the film, but at the same time, it's not, you know, it's the story we told, and I don't think it's our responsibility one way or the other.
I think the guy was just really appalled by the lifestyle, which I think he didn't even know people lived like that. So I think it wasn't so much the depiction. I think he was just, it was the way Michael said it, that the guy was just, I guess he was really square. He went, he saw, because he said, you know, what should I do to, why should we let you out of jail? And he said, well, have you seen the movie? And it was Michael's suggestion that they go watch the movie, even though he hasn't seen it. And that the guy was appalled by the quote unquote lifestyle. So just to let you know what it was that was said. This is not a question, I just,
Right.
it's just how that played out.
You see, it's interesting that I think when Michael came to New York and found a way to make his mark with the club kids, it was on his part and on the part of the people who followed him, an act of defiance. And that act of defiance was saying, you may judge us, you may hate us because we're gay or because we're effeminate or because we're interested in fame, but we're not going to apologize for that. That's who we are. And I felt that that's always what appealed to me about the club kids, was that they were defiant. They weren't going to be the sissies who were bullied in the schoolyard anymore. They were going to stick up for themselves, and they did. And you can't help the fact that there are still going to be people out there who are still going to bully you and judge you and want to lock you up or not want to let you free or not let you want to be who you are. And there's nothing you can do about that. But I do think by and large, with the exception of the drug addiction and the murder, I do think that the club kids have inspired many people to be more courageous about their lives and their individuality. So it's good and bad.
On a final note,
Yeah.
how do you think Michael will adapt to this new society once released? Any expectations for him?
I think that Michael has an incredible opportunity to start over and to make a fresh start. I've always felt Michael is an incredibly intelligent, smart, creative person, and that going down the path of drug addiction and committing an act of murder was not really central to his journey. It's a terrible tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy for Angel and his family and his loved ones. It's also a terrible tragedy for Michael because it isn't the truth of who he is. And Michael has paid the price for that, rightfully so. But I hope that when he comes out of prison, he is able to leave that behind since he has paid his dues. And while I don't believe he will ever forget what he's done or actually forgive himself for what he's done, I hope he will have enough gumption still within him to make a new start. Because I think that he is incredibly creative. I think he's a great artist, and I think he has fantastic ideas, and he really could still contribute. And I feel he kind of actually owes that. He owes that more than the time he spent in prison. He owes that to people to really give of himself, I think. And so I would hope he stays out of clubs and avoids drugs and just focuses on being the brilliant, creative, maverick individual he is.
Room tone, please.